Welcome to this live cast on our future economies. Capitalism, despite the tremendous increase in worldwide welfare through its innovative power and freedom, has at the same time a number of negative consequences. A transition is necessary to overcome ecological destruction, decrease in quality of life, and growing inequality. Given geopolitical developments, Europe has an important role to play in this transition. In the livecasts, we will start an open dialogue and discuss this transition with internationally renowned economists from all over the world. Questions will pass by, such as: each week, we will discuss these matters with 2 economists, resulting in 10 online dialogues in 10 weeks, where we will share viewpoints and collect ideas on how capitalism's innovative and creative powers can go hand in hand with fostering an equal and just society. A different subject every week. Together, we can build a basis for economies that are beneficial to all of us. You can participate by putting your questions and remarks in the chat. So, let's talk.
Ms. Foroohar, before we start and get into all of this, in 2019 you wrote a book called Don't Be Evil, and first off I'd like to congratulate you because the book is currently being pressed and printed, and it will appear in the Netherlands within a few weeks. We have the first copy here, so congratulations with the book, and I hope that a lot of Dutch people will read it as well.
Yeah, the title is in Dutch. Very Dutch, Big Tech.
It's a very Dutch title indeed. I guess that's part of the globalized world we live in today. But it has a very Dutch title.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the compliments about the book. I hope a lot of people read it there too. I think you'll find it interesting.
Yeah, sure do. So let's get to it. But let's not give everything away for our Dutch audience so that they will still have a reason to buy the book. Today we are talking about monopolies and new forms of power concentrations, obviously. And there's a lot to discuss here. The internet now is about 30 years old, and in human years you could say that we could consider that maturely adult. Yet the image you paint in your book in Don't Be Evil is more of an internet which is an adolescent gone astray. Now you give several explanations for that, and I'd like to explore all of them, but I hope we can get to it. But the crux of it, if I understand it correctly, is that at some point the internet lost its innocence. And that moment coincides with the rising influence of finance within Silicon Valley, so to speak. And what happened there? What happened at the moment, and what has been the effect of this collision for the internet as we know it?
So big question, but let me throw out a few thoughts to begin. The consumer internet, as we know it, really started to take shape in the mid-1990s in Silicon Valley, and that's right about the time that Google was started. And one of the things I did in my book to really understand where we were and where we are today is to go back to the paper that was done by the founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, and to sort of see what were they thinking? What did they think the search engine would be? And it's quite a fascinating paper. Anyone can find it online. One of the most fascinating details, and I encourage you to keep reading to the very end, is in the appendix section on page 37, where they talk about what could be the problems of a large-scale search engine that was run for profit. And what they made clear was that they expected that there could be misuse, disinformation, manipulation by both private sector and public sector actors if you were using targeted advertising as a way of monetizing a search engine. And for those that don't understand what that phrase targeted advertising means, it's what Shoshana Zuboff, a Harvard academic, would call surveillance capitalism. It's the idea that you as a user are being tracked, your movements are being tracked online, and then your behavioral voodoo doll, as you might call it, is being sold to the highest bidder, to advertisers who can then target you more precisely. So the founders of Google knew at the very beginning that this was rife for manipulation. And that's exactly what we're seeing going forward. Unfortunately, when companies are born and they're idealistic, they have venture capitalists and they eventually have to go public and make money. And as I tell in my book, the story of Google and its early motto, "Don't be evil," began to be discarded basically right after the IPO. The company decided to go with targeted advertising as a model. It really ramped up that process in the early days after going public. Eventually, because of the network effects, which allow the biggest platforms to get bigger and bigger and bigger and ring fence data, it was able to essentially eat pretty much all media. Basically, most of the 90% of the new advertising dollars go to either Google or Facebook. It was able to become the purveyor of the world's information or misinformation, as the case may be. And it has grown to a size that is really, even by the standards of past monopoly powers, the 19th century railroad trust, et cetera, is gargantuan. Google has 92% of the world's search engine action. And one of the things that I'm very interested, that I think Europe came to see early and America is now beginning to see, is that this isn't really about the price of goods, it's about power. So in the past in America, the way in which we have thought about antitrust policy for the last 40 years or so, the idea is, hey, as long as things are getting cheaper, as long as consumers can buy products and services more cheaply, there's no problem, there's no monopoly. But in this new world of surveillance capitalism, you are not paying in dollars, you are paying in data. So we all go online, we type in our Google search, we think we're getting something for free, but in fact, we're being monitored and we are giving away a lot of value in the form of our data. We don't understand how much that's worth to the company. That is an opaque transaction. That actually goes against the very basic notion of how free markets should work. I mean, Adam Smith, the father of modern capitalism, would have said that you needed three things in order for markets to work properly. You need equal access to information. You need transparency, meaning a shared understanding of what is happening amongst both parties. And you need a shared moral framework. I would argue that none of those things are in effect in the digital world. And so really this is about power. It's not about price, it's about power. Europe understands that. America now, with the big DOJ antitrust suit against Google, I think is beginning to understand that. Our House Judiciary Subcommittee put out a 450-page report looking at how big tech operates. This is a lot about power. It's a lot about cognitive capture. It's a lot about the way in which the network effects work. So I'll stop right there, but I think basically we are headed into a new world where we're really beginning to see the ramifications of what the transformation has been in the last 20 years.
Now, at some point in your book, Ms. Foroohar, you mentioned that these firms have kind of convinced us that instead of the usual thinking that monopolies are bad, full stop, they've talked us into convincing us. They try to convince us that monopolies aren't necessarily bad as long as they don't, for example, as long as they don't pose a hazard towards consumers, for example. Right? Yeah. So they've kind of whitewashed the idea of monopolies. How did they do that, and why is it so nefarious to markets?
Well, again, this really goes to the idea of this not being about consumer price, right? And also the power of the network effect. So the truth of the matter is, as these platforms get bigger, as they collect more data, they become more powerful, they become more predictive. They do, in some cases, provide better services. I mean, there's no question about that. But what is the definition of better? We don't really know. We don't understand how much value we're giving up to get what is supposedly better. Meanwhile, different actors, smaller companies, European companies, competitors from outside the tech space are being cut out of potential competition because they don't have access to this data. They cannot even get into the ecosystem to start their new plays. Perfect example. I mean, there are a number of search alternatives, out there in the universe right now. Some of them have been started by longtime founders in Silicon Valley that are concerned about surveillance and about privacy and about antitrust. But it's very difficult for them to gain traction in a world in which the largest platforms are basically unregulated. So, as Marguerite Vestager in Brussels has said, this is not about price. This is not even just about consumer welfare. It's about the broader health of an ecosystem. You need to have many, many different companies and even public sector actors being able to get access to that information. You need individuals being able to recapture some of the wealth, be it in the form of a digital dividend tax, which is something France, California, Australia, many other nations have considered. Yeah. Power has to be shared.
So we've now discussed about Google, but the big tech is often mentioned as a group, right? They're a group of Silicon Valley firms, and one of the things that you mention in the book is that they share certain interests with one another. Especially when you, for example, when we consider the patent law reforms, which they advocated under the Obama administration you mentioned, right? So they wanted these patent law reforms under the guise of that information wants to be free. And I'd like to ask you, how successful have they been at the attempt within these patent law reforms? What has changed in their favor, and how does that influence us today? How can we visualize, for example, the monopoly power that you mentioned?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, and Jonathan, I'm sure, will have things to say about this as well, because the way in which the big tech players manipulated patent law is very similar to the way in which they manipulated copyright law. So the idea is they are trying to monopolize whatever is out there and make it free so that it can be searched and monetized on their platforms. That is harmful to creators, to musicians, to artists who might have copyrights on things, but it's also harmful in many cases to inventors who happen to have patents on technologies that they might need. And this really played out, this was something that played out in a little over 10 years ago or so in the wake of the Obama administration. There was a lot of capture actually within the White House by Google. A lot of Google employees went to work in the White House. A lot of Silicon Valley employees went to work there. By the way, that's another thing that we do in the US that's kind of unique, is there's a tremendous back and forth between the private sector and the public sector, no time limits, lots of vested interests. So you had, companies, not just Google, but Apple, Intel, others that wanted to incorporate bits and bobs of technology that was patented. Well, they want to have to pay as little as possible for those technologies. And so they want to shift the patent system so that it favors their business model, which is essentially about aggregation rather than, at this stage, innovation. The innovation tends to happen in much smaller firms, typically before they go public. The aggregation happens later. So the fact that they were able to do this, I think the core point here goes to what I consider to be the biggest problem in America today, which is money politics. Big tech is the largest single lobbying force in Washington right now. There is a tremendous amount of cognitive capture of regulators. There's a lot of sort of expert speak, a lot of blurring and complication of issues that really can be made quite simple. Do we have a regulatory system that serves consumers, citizens, and a broad swath of businesses, or do we not? There's a lot of, sort of hordes of Silicon Valley technocrats that come to Washington and tell us it's all too complicated and really only they can regulate it. This is all part of the problem that we have, where there has been a hijacking of economic and political power, and it needs to be curbed.
Thank you, Ms. Foroohar. Thank you. Looking forward to the next part of the discussion where we will discuss this at length.